Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm sure you're aware that whenever you visit your primary doctor, perhaps you have to see a medical specialist of some kind. And certainly if you're ever required to spend a little time in the hospital, maybe you're having some tests or scans or a medical procedure, or even if it's a hospital admission, the question they ask is always the same. Can you tell me your name and your date of birth? Right? I mean, that's the routine. You give them the mandatory answer. I wonder sometimes as we get a little older, and memories kind of fade, if we forgot our birthday, we're going to be in a heap of trouble sometime because that's not going to open a door at all. Now, I promised you a couple of months ago that I would only use my recent stay in the hospital. It was only for 3 days. I would only do it illustratively if it were really relevant. So far, I've done okay. This will only be number 2. So hang with me. But by the time I got into the cardiac cath lab for let's say a minor procedure, I thought there would be some reaction because, minor procedures in a cardiac cath lab is when somebody else is having it done, right? But I was, me, I'm going to be talking to a lot of people. And so by the time I got into the preparation place, I'd been chatting with everybody and knew all the helpers there. And so while we're waiting for the cardiologist to prep himself, one of the assistants, she was standing right here beside me where I was laying, and she asked me the obligatory question. Bob, can you give me your name and date of birth? I said, Bob Disher, 8/8/69. She didn't say a word. She just continued right on with the preparation. Finally, I looked at her and I said, I knew it. I knew y'all don't ever listen. Y'all just ask the question, but you never listen when a patient gives you their date of birth. And so she said, well, what did you say? And I said, 8/8/69. And so she's checking the little thing on my wrist, and she said, you weren't born in 69. And I said, you want to bet? And then I told her my story. Some of you already know this, but today is my 52nd birthday. So, no problem if you forgot to send me a card, I get that, but I certainly don't expect you to remember, but I know what you're thinking. Bob, you look a whole lot older than 52, and you'd be right. My mom gave birth to me on April the 2nd, 1952. My mom is 93 years old and amazingly very alert these days, but she would tell you that after 4/2/52, her life was never the same. I would tell you that on August the 8th, 1969, that was the day that I gave my life and my future to Jesus Christ. That was the day that I was born again. I have never been the same since that time. Everything changed, everything. Was almost a high school senior, just a month away from being a high school senior. My priorities, my passions, my values, and my attitude, everything changed. And eventually that one decision would radically alter the direction of my future and my career. So my name is Bob Disher. 8/8/69. So God, we pray that you would honor our time together today, that you would use our time to not just open this word from you, this scripture, but that you would also use it to open our eyes, and if necessary, would you pry open our hearts and penetrate us as only you can do by Spirit power. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. So what are the chances that you're gonna wake up one day soon? You're gonna turn on the morning news and you're gonna hear a report about a life-changing revival that's just sweeping from one side of America to the other. You imagine turning on a 24-hour news service on TV and seeing this, somebody announcing that God has decided to make his voice strong and compelling and penetrating, that The more than 300,000 local churches across America and millions of believers devoted to Christ are working hard to get things turned in a new direction. But what if I told you that the chance of that happening and the greater chance that things are going to get worse if we fail to experience a sweeping radical move of God, there's a good chance. Since the early days of the 18th century, this was colonial America, as you know. Our nation was still trying to figure things out, still trying to define itself, clarify its vision. The leaders were still trying to figure out, can we estimate the cost of independence? Can we establish a foundation for the future? But since those early days of that century, there had been 4 spiritual awakenings. The first was between 1730 and 1740, 13 American colonies, led by the names of some people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John and Charles Wesley as the leading voices. I said to Susan the other day, you think I could preach better if I wore a wig? Jonathan Edwards. So I dug this out of the archives this week. This is his famous or infamous sermon. Some of you have heard about it. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Preached on July the 8th, 1741 at Northampton at Christ Church. Not exactly your make you feel better sermon, I'll tell you. The Second Great Awakening was between 1790 and 1850. The champions of that era were Charles Finney, Henry Ward Beecher, and the famous Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury. The Third Revolution stretched from 1860 to the 1920s and included the strong voices of people like Dwight Moody, Charles Spurgeon, Ira Sankey, William Booth, who eventually established the Salvation Army. This church was birthed during that particular era of Great Awakening. And then the Fourth Great Awakening in American history stretched from 1960 to 1980. Many of us were born by that time. And that revival found its momentum with the preaching and influence of people like Billy Graham, Martin Luther King Jr., Pope John Paul II, and Bill Bright, who established Campus Crusade for Christ. Let me tell you something, my friends. There are political and moral and social challenges in our 21st century right now that are suggesting that God might be positioning himself to initiate a fifth great awakening. Maybe to serve as a call just to kind of stir up and wake up some sleepy American churches, maybe infuse those churches and the people in those churches with spirit, power of influence. But I'm going to tell you that, when I take a longer look at our history, maybe the only voice that's yet or left strong enough to slow down some of the moral erosion and decline of values in our country would be the voice of God. I've prayed a lot of times over the past 52 years since my moment of reckoning, since I was converted, that maybe it's time for the followers of Jesus to look up and expect that maybe God might awaken us and create revivals, and that we might say, come on, God, do it again. Do it one more time in our generation. Take a look at this map. The map of America. Does that map make any sense to you? What that map indicates is that all of these areas in the dark, the deep red, those are areas that right now, today, that are dealing with widespread, devastating drought, obviously covering a good portion of our western states. Now, unless you never read the news, then you're aware that, and you can see it from this map, that the western part of the United States is experiencing widespread and crippling drought. It's worse than anything that's happened since the Dust Bowl in the mid-1930s, which that's what America looked like back in those days, at least in the Midwest, just covered with massive poverty and hopelessness. Well, our current situation is being described as a mega drought. seriously threatening the agriculture and water supplies of almost 1/3 of our country. But I use that only to say to you that there is another kind of drought that's affecting every one of us, all of us across this country. And it could be another sign of the times in which we live. It's a spiritual drought. And it has almost reached, maybe it already has, a crisis level. Now, we might be tempted to call it unprecedented, but I'm not going to use that word because we totally exhausted that word during our battle with COVID. But it's a spiritual crisis, and it's causing a gradual moral breakdown in the fibers of our American life. And every one of us, we're paying a price for that. Many of us would probably come to some agreement that there is a spiritual, moral pain sweeping across our land. Maybe it's even more deadly than the coronavirus. I don't know. We probably could not have predicted the stresses that the last 16 months, the pandemic, have placed on all of us. But it is certainly, sometimes, when life puts you under pressure, it will oftentimes reveal some other things. Things like a national debt that's growing exponentially. Now, if you know anything about the scriptures, then you know that God has been very plain about being cautious about the pressures and stresses of debt, both ours and more broadly. We've seen riots on the streets and on Capitol Hill. Violence in some of our largest cities has gone unchecked. Anger and rage are unabridged, unhinged. They're at an all-time high. Racism has raised its ugly head again. Political anger and infighting at a dangerous level. So unless you've had your head in the sand over the past 20 or so years, we've seen the influence of Christianity declining rapidly as the message of Jesus began to be marginalized. Christian churches have been told over the last two decades that we should keep our message confined to our church campuses, or we're going to pay a price for what many people in this world are calling a message. They say, you have a message of intolerance and we don't want to hear it anymore. I get 2 or 3 emails every single week with people making suggestions, offering up some solutions. I totally get that there's widespread frustration. We're coming off a deadly and costly pandemic. There is career instability, frustrations with our kids who are still sitting in classrooms. My grandkids went back to school this week in Wake County. They're wearing masks. People throwing verbal rocks at each other about vaccines and variants and so. I'm not suggesting that we don't have some solutions to the brokenness that troubles our families, our marriages, kids, and our businesses, just about every arena of American life. But I am saying that if we keep ignoring the possibility that a whole lot of this trauma could be the disregard of spiritual values and virtues, and maybe the abandonment of biblical principles in a nation where people have almost totally given up on a biblical worldview, Christian worldview, that has stood the test of time now for 2,000 years, then maybe the only answer possible would be a great awakening. What if the challenges we face are not going to be solved by politicians, economists, medical science, courtrooms, first responders, corporations, and corporate leaders? What if our crisis is not going to be figured out by higher education, but only by God himself, who must be brokenhearted to see how we have just consistently ignored many of his unequaled standards and benevolent boundaries that he put in place to keep us from self-destruction? Let me describe our challenge by way of an illustration. I want you to imagine that you've got an opportunity to spend a couple of months with a medical missions team, and you're going to spend it, it's going to be a cross-cultural experience. You're going to go overseas someplace, and you're going to reach out to a place on planet Earth where poverty and malnutrition and widespread disease have caused massive amounts of the loss of life. So let's say that when you start having meetings with the advanced planning team, what do you think is going to be one of the first things that they're going to have to teach you? What's the first thing you're going to want to know? You want to know as much about those people as possible. You want somebody to describe the culture, the language, some of their economic limitations. What do these people believe? Do they have any view of faith at all? Do they have any faith at all? Do they have regard for Christianity? The fact is that not a whole lot of us ever feel the nudge from God to go spend a couple of months in a cross-cultural experience. But what if I told you that there can never be a spiritual revolution until we begin to understand the people who live and work and play around us every single day? So let me introduce you to a group of Americans that we're going to be hearing a whole lot about in the next 5 or 10 years. There is this large cross-section in our American culture that is yet to be reached with the gospel. These are not atheists and agnostics. They're not even irreligious. They're not immoral. But they represent a growing group of Americans that we call cultural, casual, unsaved Christians. Now, immediately some of you are going to say, oh, whoa, Bob, unsaved Christian is an oxymoron. A Christian is somebody who is saved. Let me clarify that. In a couple of weeks, tens of thousands of college students, and quite a few in our church, they're going to be returning to campuses all over this country, including a mile and a half down the road at Elon University. And even though many of those emerging young adults, many of those kids were exposed to some kind of religious faith over the last 18 to 20 years of their life. The overwhelming majority, though, will fit into one of these three groups: cultural, casual, unsaved. Now, there are some agnostics and atheists that will show up on college campuses, but they're not the majority, not even close. Most of the students, and quite frankly, most of the faculty, have some form of spirituality and maybe even a fuzzy idea of God. And the majority, if we passed out a survey and there was one sentence on here with a box that says, I believe in God, most of them would check the box. That's not what it means to be a follower of Christ. Check the box, no. And guess what? We can point fingers at our universities and all of that sort of thing, but the same is true on the street and the neighborhood where you live, and the places where you go to work, and the places where you go to shop, or the coffee shop that you frequently go to, or the people that sit in your classrooms at school. Some of them are members of your family. And quite frankly, there is a growing group of people at SMC and every other church across this land who would fit in one of those categories. They're unreached. If I passed out a survey this morning with an I believe in God box, probably about 99% of you would check the box. In fact, some of you would be insulted that I would even ask. But that doesn't automatically mean that you're sold out to the values and the virtues and priorities of Jesus. Not even close. It certainly would not suggest that you have a biblical worldview. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not putting myself in a judgment seat. I'm not trying to look at people and try to figure out who's a devoted follower of Christ and who's not. That's way above my pay grade. But what we're going to learn in this series is that casual, cultural, unsaved Christianity, what it means is I'm a Christian in name only. And that's not what this book teaches about following Jesus. Not even close. Now, some of you believe that saved is a word that you used to hear at old-fashioned revival services where a preacher gets up and shouts and hollers about getting saved. Saved is a strong Bible word. Soteria is the Greek word, soteria. It's all about our need to be redeemed and rescued and saved from our sin nature. Let's go to the greatest sermon ever preached by the greatest preacher who ever spoke. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus said, "Go in through the narrow gate. The gate to destruction is wide, and the road that leads there is easy to follow." A lot of people go through that gate. But the gate to life is very narrow. The road that leads there is so hard to follow that only a few people find it. Now notice when Jesus describes the two roads, there is this wide road that has greater appeal and attraction. So doesn't it stand to reason that most people would be traveling down that road, despite the fact that people have said to them, that's a dead end. It's not going anywhere. The narrow road is scarcely populated because, what does he say? It's hard to follow. That's why you don't find many people going down that road. Now, if you read all of Matthew 7, chapter 7, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, then you'll notice that Jesus, he's not giving a lecture. Watch this now. He's not giving a lecture on what it means to be an atheist or an agnostic. What he's focused on are the people who are on the wrong road. They just don't know it. And that's because most of the people that they know and most of the people they do life with are on that road too. Look at the next part of the sermon. Jesus says, "Not everyone who calls me their Lord will get into the kingdom of heaven. Only the ones who obey my Father in heaven will get in. On the day of judgment, many will call me their Lord. They will say, 'We preached in your name, and in your name we forced out demons and worked many miracles.' But I will tell them, 'Are you kidding me? I never knew you.'" If we did a survey today, and if the one question is, are you a Christian? The percentage of people in this room that would check yes would be overwhelming. Probably not 100%, but it would be close. But right under that question, if we had a blank space for you to write out an answer, what makes you a Christian? I can think of several answers that we might give. Well, I'm not an atheist, not agnostic, so I'm not a Muslim, I'm not Jewish or Buddhist. I'm a good person. I pray sometimes. I read the Bible occasionally. I listen to K-Love on my car radio. I only eat Christian chicken because all we do is Chick-fil-A. I attend church 1.7 times every month like everybody else in America. That makes me a Christian. Notice what you do not see in those responses. It's not even mentioned the name of Jesus. It's crazy, isn't it, that here in America, millions of people call themselves Christians, but they never consider the necessity of Jesus. How is it possible that we have allowed so many people to begin to believe that their life can be described as good, generous, compassionate, faithful, Christian, but there is no mention of what Jesus accomplished on the cross? Number 3, back in mid-May, when I checked into the local hospital, I had to fill out the mandatory admission form. One of the questions was about religion. Do you have a religious preference was the question. There were several options. One option was none. Did you know that that answer is the fastest growing group in America? We call them the nuns. But the conclusion that many people come to is, I'm not one of the nuns, so I must be a Christian. But in all likelihood, what they would be describing is, I'm a casual a cultural, or an unsaved Christian. But the reason why that's so hard to understand and to grasp its meaning is because there's not an easy category for it. Let's take a closer look at Matthew 7, because Jesus says that not everyone who checks the believe in God box is going to wind up in heaven. Here's what the half-brother of Jesus wrote in his letter in the New Testament, James. He said, "You believe there is one God? That's fine. The demons also believe that." What James is saying is that just being able to check a I believe box on a survey is clearly not enough. It's cultural or casual or unsaved Christians. They believe in God. They're just not totally sold out to the truth that Jesus was God and that he died to set them free from the dangers and penalties of sin. So you should never be surprised to learn that many of the casual and cultural Christians you know, in fact, many of them who attend this church, will sometimes refer to God as, the man upstairs. Or, well, Bob, God is kind of like a rabbit's foot, sort of a lucky charm. There are people who wear crosses. Some people I notice have crosses tattooed on their bodies, but they don't know what it means. When we mention Jesus, when we say the name Jesus, you can't imagine the people who say, "Man, I'm hanging on to Jesus because he's my good luck charm." Hebrews 1, long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. There were several hundred years of prophetic history. And now in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. Authentic, sincere Christianity is grounded in knowing exactly who Jesus is and what his life, public ministry, and ultimately his death and resurrection mean to us in this life and for the life to come. In fact, some of us are convinced that all of these good things that we do are storing up brownie points that will someday impress God so much that he will just swing open the doors of eternity and welcome us in, and if necessary, he'll curve the grades. But the fact is that some of the good things that we do are the very things that keep us from selling out to Jesus. So he said, same sermon, "On the day of judgment, many will call me their Lord. They will say, 'We preached in your name, and in your name we forced out demons and worked many miracles.'" That's their resume. What Jesus is saying is that sometimes we deceive ourselves with a long list of accomplishments, compassionate deeds of generosity, and then we find out that we thought those things were going to be enough to win God's favor. Nothing about trust or faith in Jesus to redeem us from the depravity of our sin. So, how is it that good people don't wind up in heaven? How is it that we play the good person card and have Jesus say, "I never knew you"? It happens when we play this comparison game. And the challenge with comparison, have you noticed this? That we almost always compare ourselves with people that we are convinced are not as good as us. We don't ever look up. The fact is that many of you probably most of you are better than average. But I'm telling you that your neighborhood standards, the principles that you live by, the ethical values of the foursome that you play golf with, the women in your study group, the kids in your history class, the generous way maybe you tip servers at the restaurant, those are not the benchmarks. So what are the yardsticks? The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah, God said to him, I, the Lord, search all hearts and examine secret motives. So many people get convinced that the destructive, sinful decisions they make are just a doggone it, a series of mistakes. I believe it was Andy Stanley who said that would make us mistakers and not sinners. So around here, when we talk about how broken we are, when you hear me say, how many times, that we are a colossal collection of moral misfits, what we're really talking about is that's the result of our sin nature. So instead of approaching the throne of God and saying, God, you know that by and large I'm a pretty good person, it's more accurate to say, God, I'm a sinner in need of a Savior and a Redeemer. Would you have mercy on me? Many of you have heard of David, the Old Testament king. He really went sideways, as you probably know. At one point in his life, there was adultery and infidelity. And then, watch this, after he came to his senses and was confronted by one of God's prophets, look at how David expresses his regrets and his confession. Psalm 51, David writes, for I recognize my rebellion haunts me day and night. Now watch this. Against you, O God, and you alone. He doesn't mention the sin that was created with somebody that he was not married to. You and you alone, that's where I have sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight. I'm telling you, there's something at the core of casual cultural Christianity that believes that life, work, family, and health, if they're all going well, then basically we don't need God. Only when something breaks do we scream out in God's direction. Back when I was in the seminary, we used to call that foxhole religion. Have you ever heard that phrase before? That's because you almost never find an atheist in a foxhole when the bullets are zooming by. So there's a vitally important intersection in everybody's life when we come to realize that we will stand before God someday and with nothing more than our scorecard or our track record. And if that's the end result, then that's going to be real trouble. We call that self-righteousness. The word righteousness simply means to be right with God, to have a right standing with God. Self-righteousness means that you've decided that you're right with God based on your own capabilities. Devoted followers of Jesus stand before God on the merits and the values of what Jesus accomplished on the cross. That's why we refer to Jesus, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, that's why we called him a substitute. He was substituting for me. I was supposed to be the one destined to pay for my sin and depravity, but Jesus became my substitute, my stand-in, my go-between, my alternate. And he declared me not guilty, not based on my report card, but on the perfect record of Jesus. Believe it or not, the 16th century reformer Martin Luther was the very first person ever to refer to that moment on the cross. You've heard me say this dozens of times, as the great exchange. Jesus takes our list of sins to the cross, exchanges with us his perfect record of perfection, and then declares us forgiven and free. So if you decide that you just can't buy the great exchange, Bob, come on, man. The world doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work where one person can take care of all. Then what you're really saying is that Jesus died for nothing. Cultural, casual Christians are convinced that if they work hard enough, they can achieve freedom from their reckless life based on their own accomplishments and accolades. And if that's you, then what that means is that even though Jesus lived a meritorious, perfect life and left this planet with a sterling A+ record, the cross was totally unnecessary. I've always had this image of me and Jesus standing in front of the cross. I'm holding my report card of failure and sin. Jesus is holding his report card of perfection, and Jesus looks at me and says, Bob, one of us is gonna pay. So Bob, I love you way too much to let you be willing to, I'm not gonna let you die for that disgusting record of sin and arrogance and pride. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna give you my perfect report card, or you can hold on to it and take your chances. That's a no-brainer. So, if you start asking around, y'all try it this week, about what people believe about heaven, most people will tell you that heaven is a place where good people wind up. That might be the most popular religion in all of America today. We convince ourselves that there's some bad people in this world, but they're criminals and dictators and people who populate our jails and prisons, and pretty much everybody else is bound for heaven based on their goodness. That's report card religion. Sometime read the typical obituary. Passed away quietly surrounded by their family and entered into heaven. She was such a good person. He would give you the shirt off his back. She made dinner anytime there was somebody in the neighborhood afflicted with sickness, or he was the first person to arrive whenever there was something that needed to be done. So whenever I'm reading an obituary and the first line says that they went home to be with Jesus, I always scan the obituary to see if there is any mention at all about their trust in Jesus. It's almost never there. How is that? How does that work? Attend almost any funeral and the stories are almost always the same. Lived a good life, respected their neighbors and friends, generous, big heart, compassionate, all admirable qualities. They were the best person you could ever know. I've officiated at a bunch of funerals, more than 400. Most of the time, I'm on the program after family members and friends have a chance to tell stories and share their memories. Man, I love hearing those stories. They're awesome. Sometimes I feel like I'm those of you who know a little bit about professional baseball, sometimes I feel like the closer. You know, it's like, okay, the game's in the ninth inning and need the closer to come in. But my responsibility at a memorial service is not to give a laundry list of why this was a good person. I will oftentimes stand up and say, hey, thank y'all for all of you who spoke, everything. And then I might say to the people gathered there, everything you just heard, it's all true. Every bit of it. Thank God for this person's goodness. But then I'll say, those are not the reasons why this person is now standing in the presence of God. The reason this man or this woman is sitting at the feet of Jesus is because Jesus Christ died and conquered death. That's it. Otherwise, friends, we're banking our eternal destiny on our tarnished, stained record of imperfection. And we're basically saying to Jesus, the cross was irrelevant. The latest polls that have been taken from 2019, 65% of Americans believe in Jesus and claim to be Christians. Now, it's not my decision, it's not my responsibility or yours to decide who's a follower of Christ and who's not, but 65 out of 100 people in this city, if they were radically sold out to Jesus, doesn't that make sense that our community would be getting consistently better? I read a statement this week that grabbed me. This guy writes, Americans today want to use their social media platforms to try and prove that America is a Christian nation. Instead, what if the more important question is whether or not the people in our circle of influence are following Jesus? Pastor Tim Keller, he says that casual cultural Christians, they are people who oftentimes grew up in a great family. They put an American flag out on July the 4th and Veterans Day. They work hard. They try to give their kids every opportunity to succeed. They describe their faith based on the good things that they do and accomplished. But all of these things are things that cannot save them or redeem them. Keller says that the message of Jesus is not, watch this now, it's not the ABCs of Christianity, but it's A through Z. It is the whole story, Jesus. He's the whole story. There are churches across this community who are doing a great job at helping people understand the gospel message about Jesus. There are also churches in this town and in every town, and the only thing that makes them a church is because they meet in a building that has a steeple on it. They preach about serving the poor and marginalized, and those are good things. We do that. They talk about social justice and reconciliation, and that's a good thing. We do that. There are people there who are really good and generous, and we have people like that. But it's been a long time in some of those places when somebody reminded them that Jesus is the one who compels us to those good deeds. It's all about Jesus. They believe in Jesus, but they don't believe that Jesus was telling the truth when he said that he was the only pathway to the Father. For them, you see, the cross is like a sticker, like an add-on. The future of the next generation, like Morgan that you saw in the video. I've known that kid her whole life. For the next generation, is going to have to anchor themselves to the fearless decision that we will speak boldly and confidently about Jesus. Some of the hardest conversations that I ever have are with people who are convinced that they're devoted Christians. And then we start to talk about cultural and casual Christianity, and at first they kind of coil back like defensiveness, and it's not uncommon for a person to say, yeah, I'm a Christian because I'm not Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, not an atheist. What else is there? Must be a Christian. Then I'll say, so tell me how you became a Christian. And most of the time, what they say next doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. They might say, I was baptized as a baby, got my first Bible in 3rd grade, first communion right after that, got confirmed when I was 14, went to youth group, I attended church some, I pray some. Yep, that's it. I'm definitely a Christian. Been a Christian my whole life. Listen, nobody's born a Christian. It was this 18th century preacher and leader of the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards. He said, God has no grandchildren. We're all first generation Christians. The people who know that I'm a pastor of a church, they'll sometimes say, hey, do you get paid to be good? You're a preacher. Do you get paid to be super religious? And sometimes I want to say, I want to unbutton my shirt and say, there's no Superman cape under there, man. One person told me about his weird, he called him his weird first cousin who's really into Jesus. And then he said, I don't want any part of that. That's weird stuff. And I get that because sometimes people misinterpret our enthusiasm. About 7 or 8 years ago, one of our football players at Elon gave his life to Christ, and he was just like I was, he was with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, gave his life to Christ, started attending a church, not this church, but a church. His mom called me, and she said, I think my son has joined a cult. And she said, hey, look, we've been going to a Catholic church for as long as we can remember. We raised our son to be Christian. What they really did was raise their son to have a relationship with the church, but not Jesus. That's what happened to me. Just like you. I was raised in a church too. And let me tell you, if we were not sick or out of town, we were there. We attended Sunday school and church almost every week. Sunday school, worship, listen to a sermon, going to the youth group. Christian. First 17 years of my life. But it was not until August the 8th, 1969 that I realized that Jesus wanted a personal relationship with me instead of I've done all these things on a checklist. I was raised in a good church, no question. But that church was only a conduit through which I was eventually able to bow my knee to Jesus. Let me tell you about this church. This church has never saved anybody. Your family church didn't do that for you either. We just point people to Jesus. He's the famous one. So here's what I'm saying. The chances of you having a deeply meaningful faith conversation with a pure atheist, now it might happen this week, but chances are pretty low. Only 7% of the people that live in this community, maybe it's probably less than that. That's a national thing. 7% are atheists and agnostics in this country. So here in the South, it might be a little less than that. But every day we have conversations with people who are just going through the motions. They're trying to base their life on good standards, and all that's a positive thing. But these people were like me when I was 17. I just needed to be convinced that I wanted a relationship with Jesus. Cultural, casual Christians might be the most unreached group in America today. And that's why up until I was 17 years old and heard the gospel about a God who craved a personal relationship with me, that's what I was. I was a good kid. If you had asked me just 1 week before FCA camp in 1969 if I was a Christian, I would have said, what do you mean? I go to church, read the Bible, attend a youth group, pray before a calculus exam, respect my parents, don't drink, steer clear of fast girls. You know the drill. Those are all the things a good Christian teenager used to do 50 years ago. But when I met Bobby Richardson at the FCA camp, who had just retired from a great career for the New York Yankees, and he got up to preach that Friday night, it was August the 8th, at this conference meeting in Rome, Georgia. He simply said, I've come here today to simply tell you about the gospel of Jesus. That's what he said. And I thought, the gospel, is that that's music, that's southern gospel or something. At the end of his talk, Bobby gave an invitation. I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't grow up in that tradition, but he said, if you want to become a Christian, I hope you'll come up here and talk to one of our counselors. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm not going up there, I'm already a Christian. A few guys responded, and then Bobby said, I'm probably talking to somebody here tonight who thinks they're following Jesus because they go to church and respect their parents and try to do the right things. And I thought, uh-oh, that's me. So I approached him. He'd been my hero since I was a little kid. I was very nervous. And I said, I'm pretty sure I'm a Christian, but not like the one you talked about. And he said, "You want a relationship with Jesus?" And I said, "I sure do." He put his arms around me, and I prayed for forgiveness, and I prayed to receive Christ. And that night, I went back to my dorm room. We were on the campus of Berry College. Went back to my dorm room, and I had been keeping a little journal that week, and this is what I wrote. "I started my journey with Jesus tonight, but I wonder why nobody ever told me about this." And basically, I haven't stopped talking about Jesus since. By the way, and a few of you know this, I still talk to Bobby Richardson on a regular basis, lives in Sumter, South Carolina. He's 85. And I'll write him a letter. I write him a letter every August, and I say, "You remember?" Let me tell you, Jesus did not endure the cross to gain my respect or my admiration. He died on the cross so that guilty people like me could be made innocent. In the words of the Apostle Paul, he said, "Anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone." I'm telling you what, now I had a long ways to go back on August the 8th, 1969, but I'm gonna tell you something happened that night, and the old died and something new 52 years ago tonight. Somebody is sitting here right now and you're thinking, "Bob, you're describing me or my spouse or my mom or dad or my 19-year-old college kid or my business partner or the family that we vacationed with this summer. You're talking about them." Why don't we go talk to them in a loving way and have a much needed conversation? I invite you to. So God help us to have the courage to speak when we're given opportunities, lovingly, softly, compassionately, but with compelling influence. I pray. Jesus said, "There are 2 gates and 2 roads, but only one decision." By the way, I love your passion for Jesus, SMC. I really do.